All right, thank you. Yeah, I think for the first session, I'm really excited to have Kain talk about Synthetix. I'm personally a huge fan of both Synthetix and MakerDAO, so the next two sessions will be super exciting. So yeah, please welcome Kain.
Hey.
Hey, Kain. How are you doing?
I've got mics, so. Yeah.
So Kain, do you want to get us started and kick it off? Oh, did you have a presentation, or did you?
Yeah, I've got a, sorry,
Okay,
I've got
cool.
a presentation. I was waiting for them to go to the first slide, so that was my bad.
No worries, no worries. Can everybody see the? Okay, cool.
All right, cool. Thanks for the introduction. Those of you who've been around for a while may remember Haven, which was a stablecoin platform that Synthetix started off as. We eventually, in late 2018, pivoted to a more generalized synthetic asset platform to support different derivatives, Bitcoin, gold, silver, things like commodities. So just running through that transition feels like it wasn't that long ago, but it was actually a couple years ago now. Once we transitioned from the old Haven protocol to Synthetix, we also integrated Chainlink. So Chainlink started supporting our oracles, which happened in 2019. And one of the challenges that we've been dealing with, particularly on L1, for basically the entire history of the project, has been this idea of front running. So those of you who know front running in traditional markets or even bilateral trading are probably familiar with the idea of someone sees an order and they will go in and try and get their execution before that other person, right? So all of high frequency trading is around this kind of concept. Unfortunately, with Synthetix, it's a slightly different form of front running. So what people are trying to do is they're looking at the Oracle update that's being pushed from this kind of node network that Chainlink runs, and they're trying to get in and front run that because they basically have information about the future if they can see that. They can see that transaction coming in the mempool. So we've had a number of different iterations of anti-front running measures that we've implemented over the last 2-3 years, some more or less successful. But probably the biggest change that we've made recently is the transition to optimism, where we actually don't need anti-front running measures because the latency level is so much lower on a roll-up chain that you can actually avoid the need for speed bumps and all of this kind of crazy stuff. The other theme, I guess, through the history of Synthetix has been decentralization. So we started off as an open source software foundation. It was very centralized. There was a team of 10 people, all employed by this foundation, all writing the code, doing all the work. And we, at that time, back in 2017, 2018, made a decision as well to have the protocol not be immutable. So we had upgradable contracts that at any time, the people who were operating the protocol could submit a transaction to make changes to the protocol. That was a controversial design choice back then, and we had a lot of discussions in Reddit and on Twitter and what have you about that. But what it did do was force us to really consider how we transitioned from this centralized control, where all the concern was, into a decentralized protocol. And so we dissolved the foundation. We made a decision that having a foundation was actually kind of counterproductive to this idea of decentralized control, and that if we wanted the token holders to genuinely control the protocol, that we couldn't have this special kind of category of person or entity or whatever that had this measure of control. And so we wound up the foundation. We transitioned to 3 DAOs. There was a grants DAO, there was a protocol DAO, which basically replaced this idea of a centralized kind of gatekeeper changing the contracts, and then there was a treasury DAO, which was called the Synthetix DAO, and that managed the treasury, invested it, did all that sort of stuff. We've since transitioning and getting rid of the foundation made a number of other changes to governance, and we're continually pushing the governance framework. So now we have this delegated democracy concept. It's similar to what Yearn has and some other projects, which from my perspective is probably the kind of I guess cutting edge of decentralized governance these days, is finding a way to basically avoid direct token voting, essentially. Another piece of Synthetix history is the ecosystem. For those of you who are around in the Synthetix Discord back in the crypto winter days, there are a lot of very famous people that kind of emerged out of that ecosystem, and a lot of projects that have emerged. We've also spun out some projects like Quenta, which is a front end, which is now its own independent project. We've had Lyra launch recently, Thales, which is an options protocol, which is spun out of our binary options implementation, and a number of other things. The Nansen guys were in there early, talking about various things. So it's a pretty incredible ecosystem when you actually look back at all the people that were kind of in there in degen trading, talking about whatever they were talking about back in the day, and still there. The other huge thing over the last year has been optimism. So I'm a bit of an optimism maxi. I've kind of tempered that a little bit. I'm also a fan of Arbitrum these days. But ultimately, for Ethereum, for the Ethereum ecosystem to work the way that we wanted to, one thing we've realized is that we need scaling. It's just not possible on L1. And for me, the kind of day was Black Thursday, when it became obvious that there was just so much economic activity happening on L1 that it just was impossible for it to support all of this activity without some kind of scaling solution. And there's various different things out there, but my view is like the short term is optimistic rollups. That's where basically the tech is going to be. Long term, it's going to be ZK stuff and some other interesting things. But I think for the foreseeable future, it's a rollups, an optimistic rollups future. And so we recently, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, finally launched exchanges on Optimism, which is as I mentioned, allowed us to avoid front running and a number of other things. And then coming up, this is history, future's not quite here. We've got a testnet launching in the next couple of weeks for futures, which will be probably the first kind of competitor, I guess, to DYDX and Starkware in terms of like roll-up style futures. Obviously, there's a few other projects that are launching futures as well. But I think, layer 2 scaling derivatives are probably going to be a huge trend next year, and we'll be able to kind of challenge the centralized exchanges for dominance there. So Synthetix, for those of you who don't know how it works, I'm not going to say it's pretty simple. It's not simple, but there's a collateral token, which is SNX. You lock that token in a contract, and you mint SUSD. And that SUSD is put into a debt pool. And so if all of you out there were stakers, you would lock your SNX, you'd issue SUSD out into this debt pool, and then Jason could turn up and buy BTC or gold or something like that, and you're now exposed to that, right? So your job as all of the collective stakers is to say, okay, well, 50% of the debt pool is gold, 50% is Bitcoin, so I'm going to go out and hedge my exposure to that. And so you basically go out and buy spot gold, or you buy gold futures, or paper gold. You buy some Bitcoin, spot or futures, and you're all competing against each other to hedge your position in this debt pool, and you get paid for that. So every single time a trade is made, and Bitcoin is exchanged into gold, or gold into silver, or oil, or whatever it is, you get those exchange fees. And that's your compensation for taking on the counterparty risk and being this clearinghouse, essentially, of trading. So the nice thing about that is it means that the entire debt pool at any time is liquid. And so someone can turn up and they can make a $5 million trade or a $500 million trade. They get the spot price at the time. And in theory, it's composable, although it's not composable on L1 because of front-running sort of mitigation strategies that we've employed. But on L2, it is composable. And so what we've seen on L2 is things like Lyra, which is an options protocol, using Synthetix to basically be able to hedge their like delta risks, right? So they every time someone comes and buys options, they go out to Synthetix and they programmatically through the contracts, go and hedge that position. it's something that D-Hedge and a couple of other people were trying to do on L1, but it's just a clunky experience on L1, unfortunately. So this is the design. As I said, you've got the staking system. You lock your SNX. All of the stakers are out there. They issue SUSD. They put it out in the market, and people take that SUSD and they convert it into whatever they want. One kind of interesting, I guess, positive externality of having all of these synths out there and them being very liquid is it's very useful for AMMs. So Curve and Uniswap are both, have all kinds of different synths in them, and having those synths in there allows for things like cross-asset swaps, especially large cross-asset swaps, and yield farming as well, as we all know, has been a big thing within the Synthetix ecosystem, and there's a lot of synths that are using yield farming as well. So as I mentioned, we recently went live on Optimism. Both staking and trading is now live, which is super exciting. Optimism still has a few different upgrades and things that are going on over the near future, but we're getting pretty close to a point where we've got like feature compatibility between L1 and L2, and at that point, we're going to start the migration from L1 to L2 and basically shift everyone over to this layer 2 solution. So all the staking will occur there, all of the hedging, all of that sort of stuff is going to happen on L2. We also have a bunch of ecosystem projects, some with tokens, some that don't have tokens yet, that have launched or are launching. And as I mentioned, governance is a huge thing. We're constantly iterating on governance. We work with teams like Yearn. We're working with a number of other projects to continue to push the governance envelope as far as possible. We don't think that we've kind of reached a point yet where we have all of the tooling that we need, particularly when it comes to launching DAO-first solutions. So hopefully there's some stuff that we're going to be able to open source and put out into the community over the next 3 to 6 months, which will make it really easy for a project to turn up. Basically like what Aragon was trying to do, have this kind of tool set that you could just show up, but unfortunately it just wasn't really possible back then or at the time, and for all kinds of reasons. But I think we are getting to a point where we will have a number of different sort of tool sets that someone can turn up with a new project and say, okay, I'm going to press a button, I'm going to deploy the contracts, I'm going to choose some parameters, and it's all going to work. And then on top of that, we're in parallel to all of this stuff that's going on in V2X, working on our V3 roadmap, basically, which is a complete redesign from the ground up of all the contracts. So taking all of the dumb things that have accumulated over the last, 2 or 3 years, and rewriting them from scratch. That's it.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Kain. There's so much to unpack here. I want to make sure we have enough time.
Yeah,
but so you are actually known as, by many people, as the father of liquidity mining, because Synthetix kind of championed the model for that. So I'm curious about how you came up with the idea of using tokens as a way to incentivize usage, and what do you think about the general reliance on kind of inflationary rewards to kind of get adoption?
It's a very powerful tool, right? So like all tools, it can be abused and it can be used for good. I think with Synthetix, the kind of driver for us in starting liquidity mining was the fact that it was a very complex system. And it was, it took a lot of time for people to get an understanding of how it worked, what the trade-offs were, what the risks were. And so instead of that, we basically just created this inflationary model where people just ignored the risks and just YOLO'd in and then eventually learned about it after the fact, hopefully, you hope. So I think, it can be such a powerful driver for adoption, these liquidity mining incentives. So yeah.
And on the DAO front, when I talk to a lot of founders, they're always curious about, how do you go about the process of decentralizing over time and actually becoming a DAO? Like, what is the actual legal structure you have to set up for your DAO, and what are some tools it can use? So as someone who's kind of decentralized one of the biggest DAOs out there, what are some of the insights you have from that, and what are some maybe tactics that founders can learn from?
Yeah, so people who've already started and already created like a open source software foundation or a centralized entity or whatever, sorry that you did that. You're going to need to unwind it, is my view. It's not impossible to unwind these things. It really depends on the level of kind of complexity. One thing that I do see often is equity investors in a private entity can be a bit of an impediment to kind of decentralizing, because there needs to be some way to sort of just discharge the obligation you have to those equity holders. If you're just a kind of not-for-profit open source software foundation, it's a bit easier. So it was a bit easier for us. But I do think that there are ways that you can kind of navigate that. You can issue tokens to kind of discharge equity, et cetera. But yeah, it's a challenging problem if you've already started it. If you haven't, then going DAO first, in my view, now, even though we don't have all the tools, we've got a lot of the tools. It's very easy today to just launch DAO first, avoid all of that headache, and just kind of get yourself out there and get the project in the token holders' hands as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I do remember you wrote a blog post about kind of the DAO first approach. So are there any situations for a founder where you'd actually recommend the other way, where you start kind of traditional kind of equity company with a warrant for tokens?
Not really, honestly. These days, like, I just don't think that it's necessary. I think you just create more headaches than it's worth.
For sure, for sure. And in terms of cross-chain, I think this is one theme that a lot of people have been paying attention to as well. You see all these EVM chains that are launching recently. So what are the plans for Synthetix to go cross-chain?
So, I mean, we're, I guess, technically cross-chain on Optimism. The biggest issue that we have that's maybe different to like a Compound or some of the other projects out there is we are creating our own tokens versus leveraging existing tokens, right? So if you want to borrow and lend on Compound and you are using wrapped Bitcoin, as long as there are Compound contracts deployed on any chain, you can kind of participate in that. When you look at something like DAI, though, you have a different situation. So if you imagine DAI on Polygon, let's say, right? So now there's, all the DAI vaults, all the contracts are there. You can turn up on L1 and you can deposit ETH and you can get DAI. But you can also go to Polygon and put ETH in and get DAI. Are those two things fungible? Like they've got different security properties. It creates a lot more issues than if you're a lending protocol or something like that. And Synthetix is the same way. SUSD that's minted on L1 is not fungible with L2. And until you can kind of find a way to unify those, it makes it very difficult.
Got it, got it. Yes, so I think that's part of the reason why people are so excited about these different bridges and these kind of cross L2 bridges as well. And speaking of V3, I'm not sure how much you can divulge, but what are some of the key updates there? What are some of the things that excite you the most about V3?
I think one of the things that's really exciting is this idea of like taking the different debt pools and splitting them up. So one of the challenges is, the example I used was like gold and Bitcoin, right? So some of you out there, I don't know if Kanab's still in the room, he has the ability to hedge almost anything that exists, I'm pretty sure, right? But not all of us do, right? Not all of us have a commodities account or, a different account for equities or bonds or whatever. And so if you're participating in something where all of the different asset classes are lumped into a single pool, it can be quite difficult to hedge, right? Whereas if you split them out and say, okay, commodities is here. If you want to be a counterparty to that, you can. Crypto is here. That's where probably most of the people will live. Then you've got equities. You've got all these different things. It's a much better architecture for stakers. It lowers the risk profile. So that's one of the things that I'm most excited about.
Got it. And when you look out there, I think compared to when you started Haven, today there's so many competitors out there, a lot of kind of trading protocols. Are there other projects in the similar vertical that you're particularly impressed by or that you kind of admire the design as well?
I think the design space has definitely been explored a lot more than it was back in the day. So, DYDX is probably my favorite non-Synthetix protocol for perps, right? I think they've done a really good job. I think they've chose a set of trade-offs, and we've had this debate a little bit between us, right? They chose their trade-offs and they chose them very well. It's a decision that you make if you're not going for composability, and if you are willing to kind of forego composability, there's all kinds of cool things that you can do, which they've done, right? On our side, we basically said we want to try and maintain composability, and if you're trying to maintain composability, then you've got these trade-offs and different things you need to consider. So I think a lot of it comes down to things like composability and where it's going to live, on which roll-up or whatever.
I think we have time for one last question, so I'd love to kind of dive into your enthusiasm for optimism. So kind of what gets you excited about optimism, especially versus so many of the other layer 2 solutions out there today?
So again, my view is that like the ETH2 environment that we're going into is likely to be basically a data availability layer for rollups, right? Which means that if we want to inherit all of the security properties of L1, we need something like optimistic rollups if we're going to maintain composability. If we don't care about composability and we're happy to use something like Stockware, then it's fine. But at the moment, most of DeFi does rely on composability. It's hard for most projects to get away with what DYDX has done, which has been incredibly impressive, which is build a ton of liquidity in a little silo, right? I think for most people and most projects, you need to be able to leverage the liquidity that's out there, which means you have to have composability, which means you kind of have to choose right now optimistic rollups, which means then you need to choose an optimistic rollup if you're Synthetix, and you can't just be everywhere. And our choice was optimism for a whole bunch of reasons. The Unipig demo was super cool, back in the day, and I think we just went down the path and we invested a lot of resources into the project in terms of like engineering and everything, and that was the way that we decided to go.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Kain. This is really insightful. Thanks for taking time.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Appreciate it.